Chapter 27, Empire and Expansion, 1890 to 1909. So this is our first chapter now where we're advancing past the Gilded Age and we finally get to the 20th century. We'll see how good this lecture goes. My voice is dead, so this may be painful to both do and listen. So when we're talking about Empire and Expansion, we really get to the point where America has gone to its extent as far as its continental boundaries, and it runs out of space, right? You get to the Pacific Ocean, we even got Alaska at this point, and there's just no more land to go to. And so America actually starts then to go beyond the sea and, get in on the imperialism that's happening elsewhere in the world. And what I mean by that is pretty much all of Africa and all of Asia was split up by Europe in the last decades of the 1800s. And right around the 1890s or so, America, gets in on it as well. So even though they were a latecomer to doing this, they quickly, as fast as they can, try and get involved. China also, even though it got to keep its independence, it was very, very weak at the time. Extremely rural, still had a bajillion people, and its eastern coast starts to get, I don't want to say partitioned, but like different port cities are heavily influenced by specific countries. So they're almost, taken over by European nations. And those spheres of influence then start to compete with each other. In addition to this, a very popular book was written in 1783. It's called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. And it was written by a guy by the name of Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. And he analyzed all the superpowers during this time period, and it was his thesis, and the rest of the world agreed with him, that in order to become a wealthy superpower, you needed to have a very, very strong navy. And so a lot of the nations of the world really put a ton of money into their navies, including the United States. Another aspect of imperialism was something called social Darwinism, which was actually an extremely racist ideology that said that Caucasians from Europe or of European descent were the pinnacle of human evolution, and that's because of the amount of technology that they had at that time and the wealth that they had, and what they viewed as the apex of culture. And so, as the ideology went, it was then their duty or their prerogative, perhaps it was just an excuse, to go to the browner regions of the world and exert their influence to kind of drag the darker skinned people out of the jungle and into civilization. So, like I said, it's an extremely racist ideology. And let's face it, at the end of the day, what Europe and the United States wanted more so than anything else was to expand their economies. And to do this, you need access to more resources, so natural materials, and you need more people to buy your stuff, so you need more markets. And if you're able to do this by essentially capturing large portions of the world, then you can accomplish this. So this is some of the the social Darwinism I was talking about. Pops up in a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and in it he talks about the white man's burden, that it's up to the white man to civilize the rest of the world. And you get examples of that on this slide. So here are women, I think these are English women, and they're missionaries. So they're trying to spread Christianity in China. And here you can see they're literally riding on the backs of these Chinese guys, that there's like human saddles. And these Chinese guys would then carry these white women all over the countryside, spreading the word of Jesus. Down here on the right, you can see an example of social Darwinism of an American soldier carrying this dark-skinned guy right out of nowhere, and then you can see all the way up, and then there's the schoolhouse with the American flag up top. Here you can see an example of basically the types and development of man, where they took like an evolutionary thing where the most evolved man was basically an American right here, a white American. And then it went down to like the Slavs, right? So there's the Russians, and then it goes down. Then here you see some Arabs, and then you get the Asians, and then down here you get Indians, and then you get the really really dark skinned people. I can't really read those down here. Until eventually you get what are essentially apes. So you can see this is a really perversion of Darwin's theory of evolution, and it was used as an excuse to capture the rest of the world. This is a political cartoon from your book and from this time period of William McKinley, he was the president at the time, and talking to Uncle Sam, and basically what's on the menu. What should America seize first? As you can see, there's the Cuba steak, there's the Puerto Rico pig, there's the Philippine floating islands, the Sandwich Islands, and it really, this is what happens. So let's talk about Hawaii. Hawaii was its own kingdom. They had a royal family there. There on the lower right, you can see Queen Liliuokalani, looks like a linebacker, and but Americans had purchased a lot of land and had influence in it ever since the early to mid 1800s. And there you see on the left with the extremely sweet goatee, Sanford Dole. He's the founder of the Dole Pineapple Company, which is still around today. And they owned a ton of land in Hawaii. Well, if you remember me talking about the McKinley Tariff of 1890, it really raised the tariff rates on foreign commodities. So this would include pineapples from Hawaii. Now, the only thing that was weird about this, though, is that all of the pineapples, or I should say almost all the pineapples that were being grown in Hawaii were grown by American businessmen for sale in America. But because they were in a foreign land, they were subject to this extremely high tariff. So it was Dole and some of the other pineapple growers' idea, why don't we just overthrow the Hawaiian royalty and cause a revolt, cause a revolution, and then ask the United States to annex us. That way we don't have to pay this tariff. So that's what they did. But because it was so shady and so obvious, even a very, very corrupt U.S. Congress dragged their feet for 8 years before they finally annexed Hawaii as an American territory. And it ends up not even becoming a state until, I don't know, the end of World War II, something like that. And there you can see this is a map from your book, and it talks about all of the foreign, not really foreign because they're United States possessions now, but we'll say overseas possessions owned by the United States and when we get them. You can see we're going to get a ton of them in 1898. It's basically because of the Spanish-American War, which we're going to talk about very, very soon. So we begin in Cuba. Cuba at this time period was still a Spanish colony, but Spain was very, very weak, and the Cubans start to revolt against their Spanish oppressors in 1895. This becomes big news in the United States because really for like 100 years, even well before, remember the pro-slavery people in the South had eyes on expanding into the Sugar Islands and Cuba. So we wanted Cuba for a long time. And so the United States really takes an eye on, well, if the Cuban people overthrow the Spanish people, what's in it for us? It must have been like a slow news time too, because remember I told you the yellow journalism, Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, the two competing, newspaper moguls, they start to really publicize this revolt in Cuba, and it becomes very, very sensationalized, and it gets to the point where they realize that they could cause a war involving the United States, and that would sell even more newspapers. And so there's the infamous saying that I believe, I can't remember which one, Pulitzer or Hearst, tells to a photographer by the name of Remington, you furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. In addition to that, we uncover a letter from the Spanish minister, the dude named Delome, and in it he basically makes fun of William McKinley. And so this is causes more tension between the United States and Spain. So in addition to that, what we end up doing is, since we had a lot of Americans in Cuba at the time, is we actually sent a battleship, the USS Maine, to Havana Harbor just to chill out. And it was publicly said to be like just a goodwill gesture, but really it was meant to just hang off there off the coast, and then if Americans were threatened, that they could have an easy escape to the United States as they would load on the Maine. Well, it mysteriously blew up, and 260 sailors died. It appears, and we don't really know because they don't have this type of forensics back then, but it appears that it was an accidental explosion. So it was an accident. These were coal-fired ships at the time, and somebody either lit a match or a spark or something like that where the coal was, and that started to fire. And in the next room is where they stored the artillery shells, and of course it blew up. But public opinion, thanks to Pulitzer and Hearst and others, said that it was sabotaged by the Spanish. So this really is the spark, pun intended, I guess, that causes the Spanish-American War. There in the upper left, you can see the a drawing that probably appeared in one of them of the Maine exploding. You see all the little guys flying to their deaths in the air. And you can see the political cartoon also in probably those papers where it has here Spain, who appears as a brute with a bloody dagger. In his hand on the tombstone it says Maine sailors murdered by Spain. This is Joseph Pulitzer, Mr. Goolsby lookalike. And these are the first concentration camps that we really talk about in this class actually occur in Cuba, that the Spanish government, led by this guy Valeriano Weyler, he rounded up the Cuban revolutionaries, and including women and children, and he put them into camps, and then treated them horrifically and didn't feed them, and until they look like this. So this really is almost a precursor to Auschwitz and some of the other ones. So we declare war on Spain. Well, kinda. And what I mean by that is Congress didn't officially declare war. This is kind of considered to be another police action, and they even, to try and save face, because we were definitely the aggressors here, they try and make it appear that we're just trying to help out the Cuban nationalists, and so they put in something called the Teller Amendment. And the Teller Amendment, which was attached to this military bill, which was kind of like a declaration of war, but not really, stated that when the United States successfully overthrows the Spanish rule in Cuba, that it would then not annex Cuba, but actually grant the Cubans their independence, their freedom. Then we said in the Navy. Now, Spain had a large Pacific holding of islands, especially in the Philippines, and then obviously they still had some islands in the Caribbean. And so we sent our navy in both directions. And the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, which, let's face it, is in the absolute middle of nowhere for both of us, both Spain and the United States, is very quickly defeated. It's defeated so quickly, in fact, that then Dewey, who was the commander of the American fleet, he didn't know what to do because he didn't have enough sailors to actually land in the Philippines and capture, some of the forts that were there. So they just kind of chilled off the coast until the United States could bring the Marines in. But finally, Manila, which is the capital city, was captured, and unfortunately, really for the United States, is we did it with this guy by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo's help. And Emilio Aguinaldo was a Philippine nationalist who had been exiled to China because he had been trying to overthrow the Spanish a few years before this. So we had the bright idea of, hey, let's bring Emilio back to the Philippines, and he will help us then defeat the Spanish. And that's exactly what he did. But then when we didn't give up the Philippines, then, of course, he fought against us the very next year. So that's what's going on in the Philippines. So Philippines are captured like that. Meanwhile, in Cuba, we destroy what few boats they had and then set up a naval blockade, and then we land our own American soldiers. This time, we got Theodore Roosevelt. All right, Theodore Roosevelt he'd been in the Navy, some very, very high position in the Navy. In fact, he'd just been constantly making fun of William McKinley because he was a war hawk in the oldest sense of the word. He wanted war, he wanted war, he wanted war. And your book talks about that. Because McKinley was hesitant at first to go to war, that Teddy Roosevelt calls him that he didn't have the backbone of a chocolate eclair or whatever, some stupid saying like that. So Teddy Roosevelt resigns, and basically, I don't want to call them mercenaries, but he organizes this group of essentially cowboys to invade Cuba. And they had official U.S. titles and stuff like that, but they're called the Rough Riders, and they defeated the small-ish Spanish forces that they had there, and very, very quickly we captured Cuba. There's a map from your book showing the defeat in the Philippines. Notice where, if you look very closely here, so there's a bunch. There's I think hundreds, if not thousands, of Philippine islands, and the biggest one is Luzon, and then down here you have Mindanao. And if you look, then the capital is Manila, and it's in this bay right here in Manila Bay. But if you look, this little offshoot right here is the peninsula of Bataan. This is going to become very, very, and Corregidor is also very important, a little island off there. This becomes very important in World War II. There's something called the Bataan Death March that occurs right here. And then Corregidor is also very important. You can see Dewey coming from Hong Kong after he picked up Aguinaldo. And there's Emilio Aguinaldo right there on the horse. So, very, very important figure in the Philippine history. And there's Teddy Roosevelt and his fellow Rough Riders in Cuba during this time period. Here's the developments in and around Cuba. Probably the most famous battle is the Battle of San Juan Hill, where the Rough Riders charged up the hill and killed everybody right there outside of Santiago. You can see the Spanish fleet is destroyed, in one day in Cuba and one day in the Philippines. They really didn't have a whole lot, and we did. You can see we also take Puerto Rico and some other fairly minor islands in the Caribbean, and then we form a naval blockade very, very quickly. So this entire war absolutely flies by, and it goes very, very well for us. Very, very few Americans died in this war, and we gained so much. And we signed the Treaty of Paris, yet another Treaty of Paris. There's lots of them in world history. In 1898, same year the war started, Cuba is freed from Spanish rule. We actually hold true to the Teller Amendment and give them their independence, kind of. And then also, Spain is forced to give up the island of Puerto Rico and the island of Guam, which we still have to this day. Because Manila was actually taken barely after the armistice, because again it's kind of like remember the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812 that was fought technically after the end of the war. That's kind of what happens with Manila, and so we actually just pay them $20 million for all of the Philippines, and then we own the Philippines up until the end of World War II. And you can see from this, the United States becomes an imperial power. We're a bigwig in the world at this time, and so you can see this political cartoon here of William McKinley holding, standing on the back of the Philippines there, and who is looking over his shoulder from history, but Caesar and Napoleon, some of the big emperors from world history before this. This is from your book, a postcard of American possessions in the world at that time. You can see all the little American flags all over the world and the various people of the world. All right, so what do we do with these new possessions? So the first one we're going to talk about is Puerto Rico, and we're still dealing with this to this day. Under the Foraker Act of 1900, the Puerto Ricans get a limited degree of popular government. They don't have self-rule. They also do not become a state of the United States. 17 years later, they get their U.S. citizenship. And that's pretty much where we're at today. So Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens, but they're not a state. And, they have all of, I can't even say they have all of the benefits of being a U.S. citizen because they don't have representation in government. They don't have senators, and I believe they have one, if I'm right, one House of Representative member, but he doesn't get to vote, or she doesn't get to vote, something like that. But also, as part of this limited degree of popular government, they're allowed to have referendums. I believe it's every 10 years or so, and whether to decide to keep with the status quo, to become a state, or to become independent, an independent nation in order to break away, to secede really from the United States. And it tends to be very close, but they always remain part of the status quo. So then we get back to Cuba, 1901, the Platt Amendment. And this is even though we give Cuba their independence, so they're a completely separate country, unlike Puerto Rico, Cuba was not allowed to sign a treaty that might take away their future independence, and they're not allowed to take on too much debt. We didn't want them to become indebted to Europe, which would then give Europe an excuse to take over the country. As part of this amendment, we also basically said we can send our troops into Cuba whenever we want to restore order, and we got Guantanamo Bay, which we still retain to this day. And you can only, though, Cuba will only get Guantanamo Bay back if both sides agree to return it. And there's no way that the United States wants to return Guantanamo Bay because we like to keep our terrorists there. Okay, what about the Philippines? The Philippines is a totally different scenario than Cuba and Puerto Rico, which are only 90, 100 miles off the coast of Florida. The Philippines are thousands of miles away from the continental United States. Totally separate culture, right? It's an Asian culture. They don't speak they don't speak United States. They don't speak English. It's just a different culture. And so Howard Taft, the future president, Howard Taft gets sent there to be their governor. And here's the thing: Howard Taft is actually a pretty good guy, but you get the idea of the sign of the times and what people's thought processes were back then, because he actually, even though Howard Taft did very good things in Cuba or in the Philippines as far as building up their infrastructure and their education system and their health system, he called them his little brown brothers, which is extremely, at least racially ignorant, and definitely way too paternalistic. It really epitomizes his viewpoint of the white man's burden. And you can see Howard Taft here, walking with getting off the ship or whatever, and here sitting in the crowd, and here are American soldiers chit chatting with the local Philippines, and this is so they are our colony, even though large portions of the Philippine people didn't really want to be our colony. They wanted to be an independent nation, and that's why they flocked to Emilio Aguinaldo, who fought against a guerrilla campaign against the United States until we captured him. Then, and you're going to see, at the very start of World War II, the same day that Pearl Harbor is attacked, the Japanese invade the Philippines and commit atrocities, not just against American soldiers, but also against the Philippine soldiers and civilians. And it becomes an absolute nightmare situation for both the Philippines and the United States throughout most of World War II. And in the aftermath, we grant them their independence. Okay, let's talk about China. So I told you at the beginning of the lecture about these spheres of influence that the Europeans and we had on the eastern coast of China in the last few decades of the 1800s. Well, we start to come into conflict with each other, especially from an economic standpoint. And so it could lead to military problems, and we were hesitant to start a world war. And so our guy, Secretary of State John Hay, he sends a letter basically to all the other European nations who had influence in China, and he urged them to basically respect Chinese rights. So quit picking on the Chinese within your sphere of influence, but more importantly, just to engage in fair competition with the rest of the world. What this does is it basically is an agreement with the superpowers of the world, including the United States, that, hey, let's not cheat each other, let's just cheat China together. And I'll show you a couple of political cartoons in the next couple of slides about that. But this political cartoon you see here on the right is a depiction of the Boxer Rebellion. And there's a group of Chinese nationalists, and I think they called themselves like a thousand harmonious fists or something like that. But really, what they were is they were a bunch of karate dudes, guys who used kung fu, but we didn't know those terms back then, so we just called them boxers. And they kill, right? They kill over 200 foreigners in these different spheres of influence because they're trying to kick out all of the Western influences. And this is one of the first times where you see like a coalition of the willing, as George Bush would call them, where a bunch of European nations, including us, um, are forced to send our armies in there to put down this rebellion. And so you see a depiction of that here in that political cartoon. So here are the spheres of influence that I was talking about. You can see Japan takes over large portions of the north. Germany's even getting involved in the fun. Great Britain, of course, is always going to be a heavy influence during anywhere in the world during this time period. You see a little bit more of Japan, Russia. I mean, they're really getting involved, and here in Southeast Asia is the France really gets involved. Now this is what I was talking about with the open door. So here you have Uncle Sam here slapping the open door, note on the door, and here it's being held open by the United States Army and Navy presence or prestige. I can't really see what that says. So it's like, hey, open for business. And what are we doing out the back door? But we're stealing all of their stuff out the back door, basically. All right, moving down to Panama. So, and there's Theodore Roosevelt himself. So here's what happens so you already heard that in the election of 1896, which we talked about with the populist, William McKinley, the Republican, wins. Well, in the election of 1900, he picks up the very, very popular Teddy Roosevelt to be his new vice presidential running mate, and he wins again. And then very quickly after that, he's assassinated by an anarchist. In the meantime, Teddy Roosevelt was like climbing a mountain or something like that. He was a total outdoorsman, and they let him know that the president had been killed, and so Teddy Roosevelt then becomes president. I mean, he had quite the rise to fame in the 1890s, and then all of a sudden, poof, he's the president. Well, he wanted a canal to connect the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean, and he's not the first guy to want this. Americans had kind of been talking about this ever since the 1850s. Europe wanted this also, and so a French company had tried it, and most of them died of malaria and yellow fever and stuff like that. They had a hard time digging through the swamps. So Roosevelt came up with a plan, or I should say, people in America, with his acknowledgement, came up with a plan, several plans to where could we dig a canal. And there's a couple different places. They decided the best way would be, or the best place would be in the very narrowest area of Central America, which technically was part of Colombia. However, the people in this area didn't like the ruthless government of Colombia, so we basically helped them secede. So they revolted. And on the day or the day after that they revolted, we sent the U.S. Navy in there and basically guarded them and protected them. In return, the new country of Panama signs a treaty with us where they grant us, complete basic, a lease, even though it felt like ownership of just a 10-mile wide stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. And there it is. Right? You can see it's a. So here's South America, there's Colombia, and then up here would be Mexico and a bunch of other countries. And you can see pretty much the narrowest portion is right here. And even within this narrow portion, there's basically a big lake. But there are some minor mountains here and changes in terrain. It's just a very, very raw area to deal with. And so it took them, I think, about 10 years or so. It was a massive construction project to connect the ocean to these rivers and lakes to the other ocean. And you can see this is the canal zone, so this is the 10 miles wide zone that we essentially owned. that's a picture there of Teddy Roosevelt in one of the big steam shovels uh, to do this. And if memory serves me right, he was either the first president to ever go to a foreign country or the first one to go to Central America or something like that. In other words, it's a first. Now we have all these new possessions, these foreign possessions. We're digging the Panama Canal so that our navy can quickly go from one of our foreign possessions. They don't have to go all the way around South America anymore. And we become very leery of any type of European interference with not just our own possessions, but really anything in the Western Hemisphere, because they got big navies also, and these different countries have been doing business with them. So Teddy Roosevelt comes up with the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And like I said, some Latin American nations were still in debt to Europe. They weren't just doing business with us. And we were concerned that European nations were going to take over these countries or unduly influence these countries because of this. So the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine states that if a Western Hemisphere country has financial problems, that the United States is going to intervene. That, in other words, the United States is going to assume the debt of this foreign nation, but in order to pay for that debt, we're going to take over their custom houses, and we are going to say, no, Europe, stay the hell out of the Western Hemisphere. Now, we claim we're doing this for the benefit of the country, but really we're doing that for our own benefit so we don't have to compete against Europe for dominance in the Western Hemisphere. What happens is, let's face it, there's a ton of countries in the Western Hemisphere, especially in Central America and South America, and anytime one of them got into any sort of trouble, then all of a sudden we just throw our troops in there, take over what we want to, or fund who we want to lead, and then we make sure that we get paid and keep Europe out. So this is really the start of Team America World Police that you can see here. And this you can see the pulled cartoon is kind of showing Teddy Roosevelt and his cannon faced at Europe there, saying stay the hell out of, in this case, the Republic of Santo Domingo, but really all of Western Europe or all of the Western Hemisphere. There's a pull cartoon from your book, and it shows Teddy Roosevelt. He claimed that you should be nice to your neighbors and your allies, but be prepared to go to war. So what he called it is speaking softly but carrying a big stick. And so this is a pulled cartoon of Teddy Roosevelt and his big stick leading the different American methods of protection and control in the Western Hemisphere. Now let's talk about Japan. So Japan had, or I should say, a lot of Japanese people had migrated to America during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. Remember? And a lot of them actually went back to Japan, far more so than the Irish going back to Ireland. But they're pretty much they stay on the West Coast, especially in the city of San Francisco. So after the Chinese Exclusionary Act, that really cuts down on not just Chinese immigration, but also Japanese. But again, there's still a sizable minority in California, especially in San Francisco. And then there's a huge earthquake in 1906 in San Francisco. You can see the picture there on the lower left. It absolutely devastates massive portions of the city. Tons and tons and tons of people die. It was a horrible atrocity. So, as part of the fix it or the cleanup and the rebuilding effort for San Francisco, they actually decide that they got very few schools open that weren't torn down, and they got more kids than they have desks. And so what they do is they actually segregate the schools. So apparently they weren't segregated before this, and so they essentially kick out the Japanese kids, the kids of Japanese descent, and you can see that on that poster on the lower right there. Well, Japan goes nuts over this. They've always been, especially during this time period, very touchy about racial stuff, and really because as part of the Japanese culture, they viewed themselves as the pinnacle of racial success and racial evolution. They really viewed themselves as superior to all other ethnicities in the world. And so for them to be picked on from a racial standpoint by us, they really took great umbrage to that. And so, hostilities were, starting to fire up between the United States and Japan. And Japan had been rapidly modernizing. They just got done kicking Russia's butt, and they were ready to flex their muscles a little bit. So what we end up doing in 1908, so this would be 2 years later, is to sign what's called the Gentleman's Agreement, and it's the Root Takahira Agreement. You can call it the Gentleman's Agreement. They're all kind of the same, even though technically they're two separate ones. But both powers, the United States and Japan, agree to respect each other's territorial possessions. So they're not going to mess with our stuff in Asia. We're not going to mess with their stuff. The ownership pretty much anywhere else in Asia also. In addition to that, to deal with this issue in San Francisco, Japan is going to agree to deny future passports to the United States. So in other words, essentially cut off immigration to the United States for the Japanese. They also are going to recognize our attempts to exclude Japanese immigrants from moving around with passports. And what Japan's going to get in return is that the United States government actually, really lays down the law on the school board of San Francisco to, not segregate Asians. In other words, to desegregate their schools again. At the end of the chapter, it shows you a map of most of the world, not the Western Hemisphere, and who owns these territorial possessions. So really, in the middle of the 1800s, these are all independent countries, or at least tribal areas. But by 1900 or so, most of this part of the world is broken up by European nations. So you can see France controls large portions of northern Africa. You can see here Belgium gets in the. You got Germans are trying to start. Even Italy gets involved in Libya. You see, this is more of the Great Britain area, and then same thing in Asia. What's happening over here? In the last slide of our lecture, you can see that we start to get involved in Hawaii in the 1820s. You get Mahan's book in 1890. I think I gave you the wrong date before. And then you basically see lots of really small scale crises and small scale military engagements that start to pop up between different countries. You get the 1898, which is the Spanish-American War in its entirety, from the explosion of the Maine all the way to the Teller Amendment and Dewey's victory. Even then, unrelated, you get Hawaii annexation, and then we get the Philippines. You get the Aguinaldo Rebellion. 1900, you get the Foraker Act for Puerto Rico. You get the Boxer Rebellion. 1901, we capture Aguinaldo, and there's no more Philippine Rebellion. You get the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904. You get the construction of the Panama Canal from 1904 to 1914. You can see the Roosevelt Corollary is invoked in the Dominican Republic in 1905. And then the problems that we have with Japan is in 1906. And then you get to see the Gentleman's Agreement with Japan, 1907, the Root Takahira Agreement, 1908. Like I said, even though they're separate agreements, as far as testing wise, you can combine them into one. Nobody's going to care. And Puerto Ricans finally get U.S. citizenship in 1917, and that is it.